You have been trying to be enough for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like before the trying began. Before you measured your words. Before you checked the room. Before you made yourself quieter, smaller, less, just to make sure no one was made uncomfortable by the full size of who you are. Something happened to you. And today, we are going to sit with what that was. In today's audiobook, we explore the wound of self-worth, the tender, complicated, often invisible territory at the heart of the psychology of not enough, raised to make yourself small. Published by Unchained Heart. In these pages, we go beyond the surface explanations and the quick reassurances. We do not arrive here to be told we are enough in a way that slides off the skin without touching anything real. We arrive here to understand, deeply, honestly, without flinching, how a person comes to believe she is not enough, what that belief does to her life, to her relationships, to the quiet interior of her days, what it means to begin, slowly and without performance, to find her way back to the full size of herself. This audiobook was written for the woman who has spent years being the one who adjusts, the one who softens her opinions before she speaks them, the one who apologizes for needing things, the one who has been told, not always in words, but in 100 small and devastating ways, that her presence is acceptable only when it does not ask too much of anyone. She is intelligent. She is perceptive. She's done the reading, the journaling, the quiet midnight searching. And yet something remains lodged beneath all of that understanding, a feeling that lives in the chest like a stone that will not move. A feeling that whispers, you are still not quite right. You are still not quite enough. If you recognize that whisper, this audiobook is for you. We will move through 6 chapters together. In the first, we trace the origin of the not enough wound, how it was planted, often in the most ordinary of childhoods, in the silences and the comparisons, and the love that always seemed to arrive with a condition attached. In the second chapter, we examine what happened to your identity when that wound took root, how you learned to shape yourself around other people's comfort rather than your own truth. In the third chapter, we look at the patterns that wound created in your relationships, the dynamics you found yourself in again and again, the roles you played without ever auditioning for them. In the fourth chapter, we turn to the body, because the body has been holding the story long after the mind learned to explain it away. In the fifth chapter, we begin to speak about what it means to unchain the self-worth that was never truly lost, only buried. And in the sixth and final chapter, we sit with what life begins to feel like when a woman stops shrinking and starts, quietly and courageously, to take up the space that was always hers. Before we begin, if this is the kind of company you have been looking for, a voice that sits with you in the difficult places without rushing you toward resolution, I want to warmly invite you to follow the Unchained Heart channel. There is more waiting for you here. More of these long, unhurried conversations about the parts of life that rarely get spoken aloud. Follow the channel, and let this be a place you return to. Let us begin, gently, at the root of this. Chapter 1. The Ordinary Origins of an Extraordinary Wound. There is a particular kind of childhood that leaves no visible marks, no dramatic ruptures, no events that would qualify in anyone's official accounting as damage, just a home, just a family. Just the ordinary texture of growing up, meals at a table, voices in the hallway, a bedroom that was yours. And yet something happened in that ordinary space that lodged itself so deeply inside you that decades later, in the middle of a perfectly fine life, you still feel it. A tightness when someone seems disappointed in you. A reflexive need to explain yourself. A way of entering a room already half apologizing for being in it. The not enough wound does not require a dramatic origin story. It is, more often than not, woven from small things. The parent who is present in body, but whose attention always felt conditional, available when you were performing well, withdrawn when you were simply being yourself. The household where praise was rationed carefully, as though too much of it would spoil something. The family dynamic where one sibling seemed to effortlessly receive what you were always quietly working for. The mother who loved you fiercely, but who also, without knowing she was doing it, communicated that your feelings were too large, your needs were inconvenient, your emotions a problem to be managed rather than a truth to be witnessed. None of these things are abuse in the way the word is commonly used, and that, in its own way, makes them harder to name. Because when there is no dramatic event to point to, the wound can feel illegitimate. You find yourself thinking, nothing that bad happened to me. Other people had real childhoods to survive. Who am I to carry this weight? And so you put it down, or try to, and carry it anyway, invisibly, in the architecture of how you move through the world. What actually happened in many of these ordinary childhoods was a particular kind of conditional love. Not the absence of love. Most of these parents loved their children genuinely and as fully as they were capable of loving. But love that arrived reliably only when certain conditions were met. When you were agreeable, when you were achieving, when you were not too emotional, not too needy, not too loud, not too much, when you made the adults around you comfortable. A child who grows up in that emotional climate does not consciously decide to become small. She learns it the way you learn any language, by immersion, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of what is rewarded and what is not. She learns that the version of herself that is easiest for others is the version most likely to receive love. And because love is oxygen to a child, because it is not metaphorically necessary, but literally necessary for survival, she begins to build herself around that requirement. She becomes the version of herself that fits, the version that does not overflow, the version that does not inconvenience, the version that is, above all else, enough, in the eyes of the people she needs most. This is not weakness, this is extraordinary intelligence. This is a child using every resource available to her to secure what she needs. The tragedy is not that she did it. The tragedy is that she never stopped. That the strategy that kept her safe in childhood became the blueprint for everything that followed. That she carried the architecture of that small self out into the world, into her friendships, her romantic relationships, her professional life, her interior monologue, and kept building from those same plans long after the original conditions had changed. What we are doing in this audiobook is not undoing that child's intelligence. We are honoring it. And then gently, we are asking whether it is still serving her now. Chapter 2. The Self That Was Built Around Other People's Comfort. When a child learns early that her authentic self is too much, too emotional, too needy, too loud, too opinionated, too present, she does not simply suppress that self. She builds another one. She becomes, over many years and through thousands of small daily calibrations, a version of herself that is designed primarily to be acceptable, to be unthreatening, to take up exactly as much space as others are comfortable with, and not 1 inch more. This is what might be called the adapted self, and it is extraordinarily sophisticated. It knows, without being taught explicitly, how to read a room. It notices the micro-expressions of disappointment or irritation on someone's face before that person is even fully aware of feeling them. It anticipates what people need and provides it before being asked. Because asking first means risking refusal, and refusal means being not enough again. It has learned to experience other people's emotions as its own responsibility. To feel that someone else's bad mood is almost certainly somehow its fault. The adapted self is often perceived by the outside world as warm, considerate, easy to be around. And it is those things. But underneath those genuine qualities is something else, a constant, low-level monitoring, a surveillance system that never fully turns off, a part of you that is always tracking, how is this person feeling about me right now? Have I said too much? Have I taken up too much space? Do they still approve of me? Am I still safe? This monitoring is exhausting. Not the sharp exhaustion of a hard day, but the dull, bone-deep exhaustion of never fully being able to relax inside your own skin. Of never being entirely sure that who you are, the unperformed, unedited, full-sized version of you, would be acceptable if you allowed it to show. And here's what happens over time. The gap between the adapted self and the authentic self widens. You lose touch with what you actually think before you translate it into what others want to hear. You lose access to what you actually want before you convert it into what seems reasonable to ask for. You discover, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation, that you have no idea what your own opinion on something is, because you've spent so long editing your opinions before they reach the surface that you can no longer find the unedited version. This is the quiet devastation of the not enough wound, not that it made you feel bad about yourself, though it did that too, but that it slowly, incrementally, over many years, made you a stranger to yourself. It created a distance between who you are and who you allowed yourself to be that began to feel, after a while, like the distance was simply the truth, like the adapted self was the real self, like the full-sized version of you was something that no longer existed. If it ever truly did, it did exist. It still does. It has simply been waiting, patiently and without bitterness, for you to remember it. Chapter 3. The relationships that felt like home because they were familiar. There is a particular kind of relationship that women who carry the not enough wound find themselves in, again and again, across different people and different circumstances. It is the relationship that requires her to be small in order to stay. The relationship where love feels conditional in a way that is deeply, uncomfortably familiar. The relationship where she works hardest, where she is most alert, most careful, most attuned to the other person, and where she receives the least consistent reassurance in return. These relationships do not usually announce themselves as harmful. They feel, at the beginning, like recognition, like coming home. And that feeling is not imaginary or mistaken. It is simply that the home they are echoing is the original home, the one where she first learned the rules. The one where love required careful management. The one where being herself fully was not quite safe. The patterns are remarkably consistent. She finds herself in relationships, romantic, platonic, professional, where her needs are treated as burdensome, where her emotions are received as too much, where she is appreciated most when she is performing the adapted self and questioned or withdrawn from when she allows something more genuine to surface. And instead of recognizing these patterns as a repetition of something old, she reads them as evidence, as confirmation of what she has always quietly suspected. That she is, in fact, too much. That her needs are, in fact, unreasonable. That the problem, as it has always been, is her. There is also the other side of this pattern, the relationships where she is the one who gives endlessly and receives little. Not because she is being taken advantage of in any simple or cynical sense, but because overgiving is the love language she learned in childhood. It is how she learned to secure attachment. It is how she learned to justify her presence. If she is useful enough, giving enough, available enough, then perhaps she earns the right to be here. Perhaps she becomes enough. The exhaustion of this dynamic is profound, because giving from this place is not the generous overflow of a full cup. It is giving from a cup that is already empty, in the hope that the giving itself will fill it. It never does, because the filling that is needed is not something that can come from outside. It is not something that another person's gratitude or approval can provide. It is something that has to be rebuilt from the inside, a relationship with herself that does not depend on other people's response to her. This is difficult to hear, especially when you are still in the middle of relationships that are structured around the old patterns. It can feel like an accusation, as if understanding the pattern means accepting blame for it. It is not blame. It is simply cartography. It is learning to read the map of why you ended up here, so that you can, eventually, and without self-punishment, choose a different route. Chapter 4. What the body has been holding the mind is very good at explaining things. It can construct a narrative, identify a pattern, name a wound, understand a dynamic. The mind is a remarkable instrument for making sense of suffering. But the body does not speak in narrative. It speaks in sensation. In the tightness that lives in the throat when you need to say something true. In the heaviness that settles in the chest in the moment before you are about to ask for something. In the way the shoulders rise almost imperceptibly when someone in the room seems displeased. In the particular quality of fatigue that follows a day of performing yourself rather than simply being yourself. Many women who carry the not enough wound have learned over years to live primarily in the mind. The body became a place of inconvenient signals, signals that were too honest, too raw, too difficult to manage in social situations that required the adapted self to be operational, and so they learned to override them. to push through the tightness, to suppress the tears, to eat through the anxiety or run through it or work through it or simply, through an act of extraordinary and invisible discipline, continue functioning as if the body were not sending any signals at all. But the body does not forget. Everything that was not allowed to be felt was stored somewhere. The grief that had no funeral, the anger that was too dangerous to express, the need for comfort that was never met, the moments of feeling profoundly unseen that were folded away because dwelling on them served no purpose. All of it is held, with remarkable fidelity, in the tissues of the body, in the breath that never quite goes all the way down, in the jaw that carries the words that were never said, in the stomach that clenches in anticipation of disapproval. This is not metaphor. Those who work closely with emotional healing consistently observe that the body holds the unprocessed residue of emotional experience, that physical patterns of tension, fatigue, and chronic low-grade anxiety often trace directly to emotional histories that were never fully acknowledged. Not because the body is broken, but because the body is faithful. It has been carrying what the mind could not hold, waiting for the day when it might be safe to set it down. And this is important. The body is not the problem. The body is the messenger. The tightness in the throat is not a weakness. It is wisdom. It knows something needs to be spoken. The heaviness in the chest is not dysfunction. It is devotion. It has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, on your behalf, without complaint. The work of healing, in part, is learning to listen to what the body has been trying to tell you, instead of disciplining it into silence. This begins simply with attention, with placing a hand on the chest in a quiet moment and asking, not in a clinical or performative way, but in genuine curiosity, what is here? What has been here, underneath everything that has not been given space to breathe? You do not have to know the answer. You do not have to process it all at once. The body, like a person who has been ignored for a very long time, simply needs to know that you have stopped looking away. Now, before we move into the final 2 chapters of this audiobook, chapters that carry us toward the gentler and more open territory of what it means to begin to return to yourself, I want to let you know that Unchained Heart has many other audiobooks in this same healing universe, each one exploring a different dimension of the journey you are already on. If this voice has felt like company, if these words have touched something that needed touching, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There is more here for you. There is always more here for you. Chapter 5. The beginning of Unchaining. There is a moment, and if you have been on this path for any length of time, you may have already touched it, when something shifts. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not announce itself. It is more like a very quiet internal event, the kind that you might not even recognize as significant until later. When you look back and realize that something was different after that moment, something had moved. It might happen in the middle of an ordinary conversation, when you notice that you are about to edit yourself, that the real thought is already formed, and you are reaching for the acceptable version, and you pause. Not forever, not even for long, but just long enough to notice what you were doing, just long enough to feel, very briefly, the gap between what you actually think and what you were about to say. That pause is the beginning of unchaining, not the full freedom, not the triumphant moment, just the pause, just the noticing. Because before anything can change, something must be seen. And what you are beginning to see in those small pauses is the machinery, the automatic, habitual, deeply practiced process by which you have been making yourself smaller than you are. The unchaining does not happen all at once. It happens in accumulation, in dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of those small pauses. In the moment when you allow a sentence to finish without softening its edges. In the moment when you ask for something without pre-apologizing for the ask. In the moment when someone seems displeased, and you do not immediately assume it is your fault, and begin the internal audit. In the moment when you say what you actually mean, not perfectly, not without fear, but truthfully, and the world does not end. Those who work closely with the process of reclaiming self-worth observe something consistent. The women who make the most profound and lasting changes are rarely the ones who made dramatic declarations or set sweeping boundaries or restructured their entire lives overnight. They're the ones who learned to be present in the small moment. The ones who developed a relationship with their own interiority that was honest, patient, and crucially kind. The ones who stopped treating their own healing as another performance, another thing to get right. Because here is what the not enough wound ultimately does, if it is not attended to. It turns healing itself into a new arena for not being enough. You read the right books, do the right inner work, say the right things to your therapist, and still find the small voice whispering that you are not healing fast enough, deeply enough, correctly enough, that even in this, you are falling short. The unchaining requires something different. It requires a quality of self-witnessing that is not evaluative, not grading, not measuring progress against a standard of how healed you should be by now, just watching, just accompanying yourself with the same patient warmth you would offer a person you love, through the process of becoming more honest about who you are and what you need and what you will and will not accept. This is not passive. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most radical and courageous acts available to a person, to stop editing yourself, to stop performing acceptability, to let what is true be true inside you first, before you decide what to do with it. The cage does not always require someone else to have locked it. Sometimes, after years of shrinking, we have become so practiced at making ourselves small that we no longer notice we are doing it. The unchaining is the moment we begin to notice. And in the noticing, the door begins to open. Chapter 6. What life feels like when the heart is finally free. It would be dishonest to describe this freedom as an arrival, as though there is a final destination where the wound is gone and the work is done, and you live from that point forward in some state of uninterrupted wholeness. That is not what this is. What this is a different relationship with yourself, a different quality of company you keep inside your own life. What it feels like at first is simply less of the constant monitoring, less of the low-grade surveillance, the endless checking of whether you are acceptable, whether you have taken up too much space, whether the person across from you is still pleased with you, less of the automatic editing, less of the apology that rises before the request, less of the particular exhaustion of performing a self that fits day after day in rooms and relationships and dynamics that were built around your smallness, and into that space where the monitoring was slowly, tentatively, like a plant growing through a crack in old concrete, something else begins to emerge. Not confidence in the way it is usually described, the kind that is loud and self-assured and performs its own certainty, something quieter, a kind of groundedness. A familiarity with your own interior that makes you less dependent on external confirmation. You begin to know what you think before you translate it. You begin to feel what you feel before you manage it. You begin to want what you want without immediately interrogating whether the wanting is appropriate. You discover, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, that there is something it is like to simply be you. Not the you that was shaped to fit. Not the you that was built around everyone else's comfort, but the original you, the one that existed before the wound, the one that the wound never fully erased, only covered. She has been there all along, patient, intact, waiting. Relationships begin to shift, not necessarily dramatically. Some relationships become less central as you stop needing the validation they provided. Some relationships deepen in ways that surprise you, because the person you were being in them was never quite real, and the person you were becoming is someone the other person finds they prefer. Some relationships, those that were built entirely on your smallness, that had no architecture for the fuller version of you, fall away. And the grief of that falling away is real. It deserves to be acknowledged, because even the cage, when you have lived in it long enough, can feel like home. But what takes its place? The relationships built between two people who are both willing to be real, who are both willing to take up their appropriate space, who do not require the other to shrink. Those relationships carry a quality of ease that feels almost foreign at first, an ease that does not depend on careful management. that does not require the adapted self to be permanently on duty, that allows silence without interpretation, disagreement without devastation, need without apology. There is also something that happens in the body. The breath goes lower. The shoulders, over time, find a position that does not have to be consciously released. The jaw loosens. The stomach, that faithful chronicler of every suppressed emotion, quiets. Not because everything is resolved, not because the old patterns are never triggered, but because when they are triggered, you know what they are now. You recognize the familiar contraction. And you can, with more and more consistency, choose not to follow it all the way down into the old story. You begin to notice, too, a different relationship with your own worth. Not the performed confidence of someone who has convinced herself she is valuable, but something more fundamental. A sense that your presence does not need to be justified by your usefulness. That you are allowed to occupy space, physical, emotional, relational space, simply by virtue of existing. That you do not need to earn the right to be here. That you never did. This is not a conclusion that arrives fully formed. It is a practice, a daily, sometimes hourly, returning to it. A gentle and persistent refusal to go back to small. Not out of defiance, not out of anger at all the years that were spent there, but out of a growing, quiet, unshakable conviction that you are worth the space you take up. That your full size is not a burden. That it is, in fact, exactly right. Throughout these chapters, we have sat together with something that rarely gets named in quite this way: the ordinary, invisible, deeply human wound of learning too early that you are not enough. We have traced it from its origins in childhood's conditional love, through the architecture of the adapted self, through the relationship patterns it created, and the body's faithful holding of what the mind could not process, and into the tentative, courageous, deeply personal territory of beginning to unchained. What does this mean for where you are right now? Perhaps you recognized yourself in these pages in a way that felt both tender and clarifying. Perhaps something was named here that you have been carrying unnamed for a very long time. Perhaps the recognition itself, the simple act of being seen, even through the intermediary of a voice in your ears, has shifted something very slightly. That shift is real. It deserves to be honored. The path from this recognition to a life that is lived from your full size is not linear. It does not proceed in an orderly fashion, from wound to healing to freedom. It circles. It revisits. It has days that feel like setbacks and moments that feel like grace. It asks again and again for the same patience and honesty and self-compassion that you have perhaps found much easier to offer others than to offer yourself. But here is what is also true. You are already on this path. The fact that you are here, that you found this audiobook, that you listened, that something in you said yes to sitting with these particular pages, that is not an accident. Something in you is already reaching toward the fuller version of yourself. Something in you already knows, beneath the wound and beneath the adapted self and beneath all the years of making yourself small, that there is more to you than what was allowed. You have carried this long enough. You have been small long enough. And from this point forward, not perfectly, not all at once, but with honesty and patience and the kind of compassion that begins, finally, with yourself, you do not have to be. You are not carrying it alone anymore. End of the audiobook.